President Xi Jinping will visit Moscow for a summit with Putin in the coming months. The Wall Street Journal reporting that this high-level meeting will be part of a push for multi-party peace talks on Ukraine. The exact timing of the visit is unknown, but the Journal reports that Xi could visit in April or May, around the same time that Russia celebrates its World War II victory over Germany every year. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Moscow right now as the world marks 1 year of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Wang and Putin talked about the Chinese-Russian friendship reaching new milestones. Wang, who is the Chinese Communist Party's most senior foreign policy official, also met with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. This week, Putin also talked about the cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation and how it's important for, in his words, stabilizing the international situation. Also today, Putin followed up his State of the Union speech with an ultra-nationalistic concert. He's facing some political challenges at home, and he's trying to project unity. Putin also suggested that Western leaders wanted to destabilize Russia even before he invaded Ukraine to, quote, make the Russian people suffer. Today's speech comes after Putin announced that he was suspending his country's participation in the last remaining U.S.-Russian nuclear arms treaty, the New START treaty. Putin's State of the Union speech was also a trending hot topic on the Chinese social media site Weibo. Now, joining us now for more on all of this, including analysis, is Gordon Chang, author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War. Also with us today, Heritage Foundation Vice President focusing on national security and foreign policy, Jim Carafano. Gentlemen, great to have you both here.
Yeah, great to be with Gordon. He's a real expert.
He certainly is. We're always privileged to have Gordon with us. Let's start by talking about this relationship between China and Russia. Gordon, from your perspective, what have we seen develop this week between these two countries?
Well, we have seen China go all in on Russia, and there's been reporting recently that China's been selling ammunition and other high consumption rate items, that there is an AN-124, the world's largest cargo plane, leaves Zhengzhou in central China almost every day with these items. And so Beijing is doing all it can to make sure that Putin does well in Ukraine. And that's really an indication that the world is divided into two. There's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea on one side, and there's the United States and Western partners and our allies in Asia on the other. This is something the Biden administration doesn't want to acknowledge. And if they can't acknowledge it, John, they can't deal with it.
Yeah, you know, China says that they want this to end. They say they're unhappy about Russia pulling out of the New START treaty, James. But what they really want is they want to see Putin kind of weakened by this as well, so that he's more pliable for Chinese interests, right? They don't really have. This is not a genuine meeting of the minds, but China really sees an opportunity in a weakened Putin here after a year of this war in Ukraine.
There is not a more cynical, rapacious, unethical power in the world than China. And I think you're right. On the one hand, Gordon's right. The Chinese would love to see the Russians win in Ukraine, because then Europe would be disorganized, destabilized, distracted, divided. We could push out American interests. That's golden for China. But on the other hand, China's never going to put itself at risk for anybody. They're not going to put their neck on the anybody. And what's the downside here? What if Russia gets their butt kicked? Well, then Russia's a greatly diminished power, and China can be much more influential in Central Asia and even parts of Asia. And if, God forbid, Russia, or maybe God doesn't forbid, Russia collapses, China can start picking up the pieces. So I think the Chinese here, they're just playing everybody. This is, you know, they're just playing us all like a movie. They just want, as long as it's good for China, they don't care what happens to the rest of the world, not even the Russian allies. And I think this is the key point, because a lot of people say, well, how do we deal with this? And I think Gordon agrees with this. The number one way we break up this bromance between Russia and China is the weaker Russia is, the less valuable a partner it is for China.
Exactly. There's at some point when they become too weak and they become less of an asset. Now, I also want to talk about Joe Biden. You know, he called this a big mistake for Putin to pull out of the New START treaty, James. But, you know, we've seen Donald Trump pull out of treaties, the Open Skies Treaty, the IMF Treaty. We know that Russia does not adhere to these treaties. But the difference now is it's Vladimir Putin being proactive and Joe Biden being reactive. Right?
Well, it's kind of meaningless. The U.S. government did come out and say a couple of weeks ago that the Russians were not honoring the treaty. They weren't allowing the inspections required under the treaty. Now, we had long argued that the treaty is really obsolete. We
But
don't
again, the
really
difference
need.
here is that Joe Biden waits for Vladimir Putin to do something. The
Right.
Trump administration would actively pull out and say, "Well, if they're not going to adhere to it, why are we participating anyway?" And I think that's kind of the difference.
No, I think that's a good.
Go
no,
ahead.
I think
Sorry.
that's a good point. Which is what Putin did is he took a weakness into a strength. We said, well, he's violating the treaty, and then what Putin says, well, I'm pulling out of the treaty because you're a threat to me, right? So he definitely took the programmatic part. But I mean, the treaty's really meaningless, and the fact that this administration clings to it, and let's be honest, not just them, but also people in Europe, and not just with Russia, but also in China, we still have world leaders who think we got to figure out a way to get along with these guys. And they don't get what Gordon just said.
Right.
These people want to see the end of us. And if we don't take them seriously as enemies, they're always going to play us.
The political cartoon from the 1930s plays here. Those European leaders are living with their heads in the sand. Gordon, I want to go back to you, too, because something specifically the Chinese Foreign Ministry said. They said the New START treaty was, quote, a key peace and stability aspect that China wants to see the U.S. and Russia properly resolve their differences. But we know that China is speaking out of both sides of their mouth here because they're actively talking about providing lethal force and helping out the Russians in Ukraine.
Yes, and of course China wants New START to continue because, as Jim just said, the Chinese foreign policy is China-centered to an excessive degree. China's not a party to New START, and that means we are limiting our warheads, and China is free to continue to build at a very fast pace as they've continued to do. So we have seen China's rapacious policy, as Jim calls it, and we're not willing to call out the Chinese. And that is a real problem because as long as they continue to move unimpeded, they can take down the international system and indeed even more than that.
Yeah, the first step in solving a problem is admitting you have one. And there are so many people in the Biden administration and in Europe that aren't willing to do that just quite yet. And we don't know why, but we know you guys do understand this very well. Gordon Chang, James Carafano, thank you guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Good being with you, Gordon.